Video games are everywhere now. They've been one of the fastest growing forms of media over the last 40 years, and as an avid fan, it's been a sight to behold. But as more games are made and more gamers begin to experience them, it can be quite a challenge to get your feet wet when you're first starting out with how much variety there is today. That's the inspiration behind this list I'm calling Intro to Video Games. Basically, if all my childhood dreams came true and video games became a subject taught in schools, these are the 10 games I would assign to somebody with no prior experience. Now before we begin, a couple ground rules. First, rather than count down from 10 to 1, what I'll be doing here is going over these games in the order I would assign them. So the game at number 1 isn't necessarily better than the one at number 2, and so forth. Second, I'm going to be sticking to games with a focus on single player, because multiplayer games rely heavily on the other people playing them, and I want the games I choose to be able to offer a consistent experience for everyone who plays them. Plus, as every student ever knows, group projects are the worst. That's not saying that these games can't have multiplayer in them, but games like Team Fortress 2 or Mario Party that put all their eggs in the multiplayer basket will not be considered. Third, I'll be limiting this list to one game per franchise, as I feel getting a wide variety is important. Fourth, I'm looking at games that are possible to beat. Something like Pac-Man or Tetris can only offer so much when the focus is strictly getting a high score. The games I choose need to have an end goal of some kind. And finally, I'm only using games that I myself have played. I don't necessarily have to have beaten them, but I would want some personal experience with a game before assigning it to somebody else. But enough talk, let's get this started. Class is in session, people. Welcome to Intro to Video Games. My first choice should not come as much of a surprise. Super Mario Bros. For the NES is in a class all its own when talking about its iconic status and its importance. With over 40 million copies sold, this was the game that pulled the industry out of the dark ages of the early 80s and introduced many of the aspects of gaming we're so accustomed to now. Things like beating a game as opposed to just going for high scores, and having music be a significant aspect to the overall experience. The first few notes of the main theme are so iconic that you will struggle to find anybody who doesn't know where they're from. But despite this, the things that put Super Mario Bros. In a spot like this are its simplicity and its longevity. All you do is run, jump, duck, and occasionally climb or swim. But despite all this, the game is not so easy that you'll breeze through it without a little practice. And while a lot of other games from the NES era like The Legend of Zelda or Metroid have not aged particularly well, Super Mario Bros. Is just as good today as it was in 1985. Beating this game is a rite of passage for anyone who wants to consider themselves a true gamer, and as such, I think it is the perfect starting point. You want to play video games? You start with Super Mario Bros. If it wasn't obvious from the first entry, I feel that side-scrollers are the best type of game to start with when you're first beginning your journey into video games. Super Mario Bros. Is the best example, but some people might be looking for something with a bit more, let's say, rapid pace. Plus, if I'm going to talk about one of the iconic platforming mascots, I really should talk about the other. But this time, we're going with the second one. Now personally, I don't have as much experience with Sonic the Hedgehog 2 as I do with the original, and I actually haven't gotten around to finishing it myself, but even I can't deny that this game improves upon the first one in almost every aspect. The controls and platforming are better, in part thanks to the spin dash, and the addition of Tails and his alterations to the formula really improved the replayability. And most importantly, the ability to go fast is now present in every stage rather than just a few of them like in the original. Despite all this, the game is still simple enough from a mechanic standpoint that anybody can pick it up and be on their way in no time. What sets this game and the other Genesis classics apart from a lot of the 3D games is how the trademark speed is a reward for good platforming. It's not just something you can do the entire time. In other words, the speed has more significance here than in the boost to win games. Going fast in a Sonic game should feel like it means something, and that's definitely the case for Sonic 2. In the same way that side-scrolling mascot platformers like Mario and Sonic defined the mid-80s to early 90s, the late 2000s will be known as the era of the first-person shooter. Since then, the Battle Royale has become king of the hill, but for a while there, FPS has absolutely dominated the marketplace. And the game that we have to thank for that is 2007's Call of Duty 4 Modern Warfare. Rules of engagement, sir. Crew expendable. Call of Duty is about as polarizing a franchise as there is in all of gaming, and you'll never have to look far to find someone that has problems with it and what it represents. Activision's cash cow might be guilty of living long enough to see itself become the villain, but the first game in Infinity Ward's trilogy was definitely the hero we deserved.
On your feet, soldier! We are leaving!
Just like the other games we've talked about so far, COD 4 isn't all that difficult to come to terms with. You have a gun. The other guys have guns. You shoot them before they shoot you. There isn't much more to it than that, but that in no way means the game isn't good. In fact, I could argue that it might be the greatest FPS ever made. And while multiplayer plays a big part in that for a lot of people, what really blew me away was the game's single-player campaign. And believe me, that doesn't happen often in this genre. At a time when gamers were getting really tired of shooters set in World War II, Call of Duty 4 Modern Warfare changed things up in a big way by being set in, well, more modern times. You take control of a British Special Forces agent and a US Marine over the course of the game, and each mission offers a new and unique experience, ranging from stealth missions to full-on gunfights. And without spoiling anything for those who have somehow managed to avoid them all these years, there is a scene at the end of the first act that will legitimately leave you a different person than the one you were before seeing it. Later games in the franchise would try to create similar moments, but none of them will ever have the same impact as the one present in Modern Warfare. This game might be responsible for totally flooding the market with shooters, but that's because it was just that good, and in my opinion, has yet to be topped. Let's stick with the FPS genre and talk about realism for a minute. And believe me, this can be tricky business. Oftentimes it's something we think we want, but once we have it, we kind of wish it wasn't there. Personally, I've never preferred games that stray too close to real life, because if I wanted a realistic experience, I'd just go outside. There's no price tag for entry and the graphics are better. I like a game that doesn't take itself too seriously, and as games try more and more to be as realistic as possible, I think it's important to appreciate those that just try to be mindless fun. And as far as mindlessly fun shooters go, it all starts with Doom. I've played quite a few reboots in my day, and Doom 2016 might just be the best one I've ever played. It does a seamless job of taking the simple yet fun gameplay of the first two games in the series and updating it with just enough modern touches to create the perfect blend of old and new. What makes Doom such a breath of fresh air is how it throws out so many frustrating mechanics found in modern games, not just shooters. Rather than regenerating your health by hiding in the corner for 30 seconds and crying for your mommy, the best thing to do is perform one of the game's super satisfying glory kills. Is your ammo running low? Well, that's what the chainsaw's for, silly! Being able to carry every gun in the game at once is great for experimenting and keeping things fresh, and I didn't realize how much I hated reloading until someone gave me a shooter where I didn't have to. All of this combines to create a style of game that throws caution to the wind and allows you to just maul through everything that tries to get in your way. The open-ended levels with tons of secrets are a joy to experience, the soundtrack is just as intense as the game itself, and your character, known affectionately by gamers as the Doom Guy, is a total joy to experience despite the fact that he never speaks. What makes him incredible is his total disregard for the plot going on around him. You're not here for the story, you're here to rip and tear your way through the demons of hell, and so is he. That's all there is to it. I've never been a huge fan of puzzle games. Now feel free to make all the jokes about my intelligence that you like, but the genre as a whole's just never really clicked with me. I feel like they lack the immersion that other games can provide, because rather than putting the focus on sucking the player into the world of the game, the focus is simply aimed at taxing the player's brain, and I already have enough taxes to deal with. All that being said, I do sometimes find puzzles in video games more enjoyable when they're placed into other genres. This is very easy to mess up and quickly create the worst part of whatever game we're talking about, but when done correctly, they can be some of the most fun parts of the game. The dungeons in The Legend of Zelda and the Riddler trophies in the Batman Arkham series are two examples that immediately jump to mind. But for this list, we're going to go back to the FPS well one more time for quite possibly the most unique shooter ever made. That is, of course, if you consider Portal a shooter, which is certainly up for debate, but what generally isn't debated is that this is an experience unlike any other. The immersion problem I mentioned is no such issue here, as you make your way through these cold, sterile testing chambers, feeling as if you're constantly being watched. But don't think that this game is all doom and gloom. Oh no, there is plenty of humor to be found, courtesy of everyone's favorite psycho AI, GLaDOS. The game itself is also tremendously fun thanks to the incredibly well-made physics engine. Using multiple portals to build up momentum and send yourself flying across the room is a thrill that never gets old, as is dropping boxes on sentries. While Portal 2 would go on to build off of the things that made this game great, like the puzzles and the humor, I feel that the original is a better game for someone who doesn't have a lot of gaming under their belt due to it being shorter and simpler. Nowadays, it's getting harder and harder to remember that Valve was once responsible for some of the best games ever made, seeing as all they make these days is money, but Portal is a reminder of what they were once capable of and is most definitely worth your time. Also bonus points for making one of the most famous gaming memes in history. As you've probably noticed by now, two things I put a lot of emphasis on for this list is simplicity and a relatively short runtime. The question that I now must answer is what to do in regards to choosing a role-playing game. While they're one of the oldest, biggest, and most important genres of gaming, RPGs are most definitely not casual or beginner-friendly. Whether they be Western like Elder Scrolls and Dragon Age, or JRPGs like Final Fantasy and Persona, RPGs require hours and hours of commitment to really get anything out of them, and unless you played some D&D before, they take some time to get used to. So choosing one to serve as an entry point is difficult. Right off the bat, I knew I wanted to choose something turn-based, as I believe that real-time and active-time battle systems can easily become overwhelming to those not ready for them. The first candidate that came to mind naturally was Pokemon. But after thinking about it for a bit, I decided that Pokemon is unique enough of a game that it doesn't represent the genre as a whole well enough for this list. That doesn't mean it's a bad franchise by any stretch. I love Pokemon as much as the next guy. But I wouldn't use it as a starting point for someone who might eventually look into trying something a bit more intricate and complex. And if I'm being totally honest, every game we've talked about so far comes from a fairly well-known and iconic franchise, so I want to take this opportunity to look at something a bit more obscure and discuss one of my personal favorite games of all time. Ladies and gentlemen, I present to you, Glory of Heracles. I'm sure that most of you are surprised by this choice, and I don't blame you one bit. Glory of Heracles is anything but a household name. But even putting my own love and bias towards the game to the side, I can tell you from experience that this game is the perfect starting point for anyone looking to get into RPGs. Glory of Heracles is the very first RPG that I ever played, and I wouldn't have it any other way. Everything in this game is easy to get to grips with. Let's start with the battle system. A true turn-based JRPG to its core, it features a very simple system of combat with your standard physical attacks, magic, skills, and items. But unique to this game is the ability to strengthen your magic and skills by playing a small minigame on the DS touchscreen unique to each attack. If done perfectly, the damage dealt by these attacks can reach up to 200% in addition to getting a flashier animation. Next, let's talk about the setting and story. The game presents a very interesting take on the myths of ancient Greece, and if you have a particular favorite monster from Greek mythology, chances are it's a boss somewhere in this game. And the story, while nothing spectacular, does this job well enough to be enjoyable. You play as a silent young hero who wakes up to find he has no memory, and turns out to be an immortal that may or may not be the legendary hero Heracles. Granted, this isn't the most unique or exciting premise, but the writing more than makes up for it, including a few references that left me in stitches. But the best thing about this game, without a doubt, is its soundtrack. Every song does a magnificent job conveying the type of emotion the game is trying to get out of you at a particular moment. Special nod goes to the overworld theme of the desert area and the Mount Olympus battle theme. Lastly, the game as a whole, while not beatable in a weekend, doesn't reach the obnoxious playtimes of other RPGs and shouldn't take you more than about 25 hours to finish on your first playthrough. And while this list was made with people new to gaming in mind, I do hope I've inspired at least some veterans who haven't played this to go back and give it a whirl. I can't promise it'll have the same effect for you as it did for me, especially if you've got more than a few RPGs under your belt, but I still think it'll be worth your time. Video games are a lot like wizards. How? I'll tell you.
Not all wizards are good.
It's no secret that for every great game out there, there's at least one that's absolutely terrible. And while you would think I would want to have new gamers avoid this kind of stuff, I would argue that those who don't learn their history are doomed to repeat it, and keeping bad games fresh in our minds will help us appreciate the good ones we play and the people who work hard to make them. That being said, there's plenty of crap to choose from. But most garbage games are dime a dozen. It takes something truly terrible to live on in gaming lore and warrant a place on a list like this. Train wrecks like Superman 64, Bubsy 3D, Plumbers Don't Wear Ties, Big Rigs Over-the-Road Racing, and the granddaddy of them all, E.T. the Extraterrestrial, were all considered. But not only have I not played any of those games, they're all also really old. I wanted something a tad more recent to prove my point that bad games will always be a thing you have to deal with. Unfortunately, I didn't have to look very far. I knew what I was getting into with Ride to Hell Retribution long before I ever owned it. How could I not? This game has reached legendary status in the realm of terrible games and is often considered the worst game of the 7th console generation. Do I even need to explain what's wrong with this game? I mean, come on, look at it. If you didn't know any better, would you honestly think that this came out within the last 10 years? The graphics are hideously outdated for 2013 standards, the music is repetitive and bland beyond belief, and the rest of the sound design, particularly the voice acting, is atrocious. That is, of course, if there's any sound at all, because you'll come across many instances where sounds are just straight up missing. A lot of this could have been forgiven if the game itself was decent, because then you could just pass it off as simply another below average title. But whether it's the unpolished knockoff of Batman Arkham's combat system, the shaky motorcycle sections that'll just spit you away up the road if you bump into anything, and gunplay where the only thing that has any sort of effect is a headshot, and even then sometimes it takes more than one because you could end up just knocking a guy's hat off Legend of Zorro style, everything here is nothing more than a steaming pile of junk. But I've beaten around the bush long enough. The sex scenes are the most uncomfortable thing I've ever seen in a video game, and what truly put Ride to Hell over the top as one of the worst of all time. But even with all that said, this is still a game I would recommend playing. Not just because it needs to be seen to be believed, but also so one can understand just how south things can go no matter how far the industry has come along. This was supposed to be an open world biker game unlike anything we've ever seen before. Well, at least they succeeded at one thing. I have never seen a game like Ride to Hell Retribution before, and I doubt I ever will again. I've teased at a Legend of Zelda entry on this list multiple times now, and I think it's finally time to end the waiting. Zelda is one of my favorite franchises of all time, and is in my opinion the perfect series to represent the adventure game genre on a list like this. The only question now is which one to choose. There have been numerous occasions over the course of the franchise's near 35 years of existence where one of its titles has not only been considered one of the best games of its generation, but one of the best of all time. A Link to the Past defined the 16-bit era as few other games could, whilst Majora's Mask only seems to get more popular as time goes on. Twilight Princess had quite possibly the most legendary reveal in the history of E3, and then went on to live up to its hype as the prototypical Zelda. And I don't remember the last time a game was as universally praised as Breath of the Wild. But as we've seen thus far, the biggest keys to earning a place on this list are simplicity, accessibility, and significance. And for that, nothing tops Ocarina of Time. Now let's get one thing straight right away. I do not think that Ocarina of Time is the greatest game ever made, but no other game in the series is quite as iconic as this one. This is the game that laid the foundation for 3D open world exploration. This is the game that pioneered the L targeting system used in 3D Zelda games to this day, and even found its way into Hyrule Warriors. This is the game that set the franchise's timeline spiraling into absolute chaos, igniting one of the oldest and most delved into talking points amongst a fandom ever, for better or worse. This game is so many things to so many people, it's easy to forget that when you strip all the accolades away, the game itself still holds up after all these years and is a joy to play through. This is the perfect starting point for anyone looking to get into Zelda because it has a little bit of all the different aspects that later titles would go on to improve. If you like the dungeons, Twilight Princess is the game for you. You like the side quests? Then head over to Majora's Mask. Does exploration fill you with a sense of awe? Breath of the Wild is going to give you all you can handle. And if you like this game but decide playing another one like it is a tad too daunting, then something like A Link to the Past or A Link Between Worlds just might strike the perfect chord for you. There's no other way to describe this game other than as a benchmark in the history of gaming. This might be the best game of all time. Perhaps it once was, but time has since allowed for greater heights to be reached. Maybe it never was. You can debate that all you like, but what you can't debate is that Ocarina of Time, whether or not it's the best, is certainly one of the most important and a vital starting point for anyone looking to get into video games. The debate over whether video games can be considered art is a fascinating one, and you'll find credible and respectable opinions on both sides of the argument. For me, art is defined as a creation designed to elicit a response based in emotion. Something like a news report or a scientific article, while being the creation of a human being, wouldn't be art to me because at their core, sensationalism and bias aside, all they're meant to do is convey information of some kind to those who consume it. Video games would fall under the category of art in my opinion because they can elicit an emotional reaction from those who experience them, and many do. Dynasty Warriors, for instance, is meant to give you a power trip, whereas Silent Hill is designed to scare you. Mother 3 is aiming to pull at your heartstrings versus something like Bioshock that's trying to make you think. But what sets video games apart from other art forms is the way in which they convey their meaning. Things like movies, novels, and songs are conveyed from the first person or the third person. Either someone is telling the story to you, or you're observing the story play out. With video games, you could make the argument that the message is being conveyed through the second person, because you're the one causing the story to progress. Your actions determine what unfolds. If anyone's interested, I highly recommend checking out the Superhero Rewind video on Batman Arkham Asylum over at Deepvolution. I'll leave a link down in the description. The video's kind of old, but they do a much better job breaking down this topic in more detail than I ever could. But the point of all this was to find a game that is often used in the art debate, but is also still a game that is just interesting enough to play on its own. So with that in mind, Shadow of the Colossus. In the same way that a painting like the Mona Lisa has been examined in a million different ways, Shadow of the Colossus has been picked apart and analyzed by countless people over the course of its existence, so I'll do my part to give a quick overview without the spoilers. Boiled down to its simplest essence, Shadow of the Colossus is a game all about traveling across a massive empty overworld and fighting 16 giant bosses. And that's basically all there is. There isn't all that much more to it, but that's what makes it interesting. The lack of content in this game isn't the result of poor design or a rushed product. Everything in this game was created with a purpose in mind, and that purpose is up to the player to discover and understand. Like, why is the world so big but so empty? What is the outcome of all your actions going to be, and why must these colossi be vanquished? All of these questions will be answered over the course of the game. But what I think is the most interesting thing going on in this game is how it takes the art of progression and turns it on its head. Most games are designed to make you feel better as you go along. Your skills improve, you conquer tougher challenges, and you're rewarded as such. That's not really how it works here. As you defeat more and more colossi, your outlook on yourself and the situation as a whole will be quite different compared to how you would feel at this point in a different game. That's basically all I can say without getting into spoilers. If none of this strikes your fancy, then Shadow of the Colossus will still offer you some great gameplay in its boss battles. But if you're the type of person that likes to examine what you experience, this game will give you quite a lot with just a little. In addition to the art debate, the other thing that makes video games unique when compared to other forms of media is the potential for accomplishment. Finishing a movie or a book isn't supposed to be a hurdle to overcome. Video games offer the opportunity for triumph throughout the entire experience, whether it's finishing a level, beating a boss, finding a secret, or completing the game as a whole. The flip side of this coin, however, is the opportunity for error. You can't really mess up listening to a song or watching a TV show, but because the progression of a game is based on the inputs of the player, there's always the opportunity for things to go wrong and your results to end in failure. How often this happens and the reasons behind it determine a game's difficulty. It doesn't matter what genre of game you choose. Some games will be easy, some won't be. Video game difficulty is like hot sauce. Everyone has a different tolerance level of what they can enjoy before things turn painful. And while I don't think you can measure a gamer's credibility just based on how many ultra-hard games they've beaten, I do think that every serious gamer should have at least one difficult game under their belt, especially if the game in question is a good one. Some of the highlights from my own resume are Castlevania, Super Meat Boy, F-Zero GX, Mario Strikers Charged, Cuphead, Punch-Out Wii, and Donkey Kong Country Returns. I would recommend all these games, but for this list, I think we need to go bigger and tougher. If this is where my intro to video games class comes to its conclusion, then I can't think of a more fitting final exam than Dark Souls. It does not take an extensive knowledge of gaming to know about this one. The name itself is enough to elicit a response. It's no secret that From Software's flagship game is not for the faint of heart. In an era of super guides and hand-holding, Dark Souls came along, told us that we would not just die, but die a lot, and then proceeded to lay a smackdown on its audience the likes of which had not been seen since the days of the NES. In fact, that's probably the best way to describe it, a retro-hard game made in the modern age. There's some sort of story going on for those who really want it, but the main focus of most people who dare to take a crack at Dark Souls is just simply overcoming the next hurdle it decides to throw at you. Now the key with super difficult games is that there needs to be some sort of motivation to persevere and keep going. With Dark Souls, you're motivated by the titular souls, which serve as both your currency and your EXP points. Anytime you die in this game, whatever souls you accumulated are dropped at the exact location of your demise, and the only way you're going to get them back is to return to said location and retrieve them. This means in the case of boss battles, which lock you into their respective arenas the moment you come into contact with them, the only way to avoid losing your souls for good is to re-enter the fight after defeat and make another attempt. The only way to break this vicious cycle is to finally emerge victorious, and when you do, the feeling of satisfaction that will wash over you is indescribable. The game is also conducive to many different play styles, so whether you prefer a melee approach like me, or a magic approach, or anything in between, you'll eventually find a strategy that gets you through whatever's in your way. And when it's finally over and those credits are rolling, you'll be able to look back on all your past struggles with pride as you bask in the accomplishment of what you just pulled off. Anyone that can manage to beat Dark Souls along with the other games we've talked about here today will have more than a legitimate case to classify themselves as a true gamer. Happy playing, folks. That is all.